Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Let's Combinate Drugs and Devices. I'm your host, Subhi Saadeh, and we are graced and honored today by Stephen O'Rourke, who is a regulatory strategist and founder of Clarifi, which is a consultancy that's helping MedTech, biotech, and novel food startups navigate EU and US regulatory pathways. Welcome, Stephen.
Hey, Subhi, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I originally reached out to Stephen months ago after one of his posts on UDI of all things went bananas. But Stephen, you recently spoke in Dubai on the hidden costs of regulatory failure and how essentially regulations, if they're done right, can drive innovation. Funny enough, I was maybe 3, 4 days ago listening to Bohemian Rhapsody on repeat. And I know you tied Queen to it, so talk to me about the hidden costs of regulatory.
Yeah, so I decided for the talk in Dubai, which was my first big talk, I have to say. So for me, it was quite a big deal. But I decided to make it a bit fun and maybe not interactive, but a bit fun, get the audience going. So what I did was I used Another One Bites the Dust, this classic hit from Queen. And the great thing about that song is the
Yeah, that
lyrics.
that
You get a
bass, that bass.
Yeah,
Da,
exactly. I
da, da,
actually
da,
walked
da,
out
da, da.
onto the stage to this bass. It was quite intimidating, but also quite, yeah, intimidating is the word. But the great thing about that song and its words and lyrics is that there's so many fitting lyrics to the world of regulatory affairs. So that's what I did. I used some of the lines to show the parallels between regulatory and how sometimes regulatory these days, if it's not taken care of properly or not implemented properly, it can stifle innovation, or at least it has the potential to do that.
There's this concept of hidden quality costs, and it's something that is pretty bona fide as far as a subject area, like the cost of quality, cost of poor quality, blue and white collar quality costs, stuff like that. That's well defined. People don't really talk about the cost of regulatory unless you're talking about like submission fees
Yeah,
or head count.
exactly. Yeah,
So
exactly.
how did you divide it up?
If we break it down, a lot of people see regulatory, or a lot of people in small companies and startups, they really consider regulatory to be a headache. But the thing about regulatory is without it, your innovation is not going to get very far. So in any work that I do, any post that I do, you mentioned my LinkedIn there. What I try to do is I try to educate. So the thing about regulatory is it applies to the whole organization. Everyone has a role to play. It's really there to help you get your innovation to market and stay on the market. And we do that collaboratively with all of the other departments. But it's really about getting buy-in from everyone and letting everyone have this regulatory mindset.
But what, as far as the cost goes, the hidden quality costs or the hidden regulatory costs, when things do go off the rails, it's typically post submission,
Yeah.
or you had a submission date that was part of your timeline and the data that you thought was going to be um, proving your case ends up maybe proving a different case.
Yeah.
So talk to me about what are the issues that you see in regulatory as far as like the things that are the most costly?
Yeah, the big one I see is startups who don't engage with the regulators early or with the agencies early. So there are
Mm.
opportunities for you to start talking with them before you submit anything. And I would advise any startup to always communicate as much as possible before you even submit anything. Another big one I see is that sometimes startups feel they can do it all by themselves. There are some things a founder can do if they're building a company, but I certainly wouldn't advise them to take care of regulatory and quality by themselves, especially if they're dealing with a medical device that they want to bring to market. So I think when we talk about the hidden costs, or rather the costs that affect regulatory, that's a big one. People underestimating how much they will have to do. But on the flip side, there is a lot to do, obviously, and you know this as well with the combination devices, which are more complex than a typical device. But if you don't if you really don't engage early, if you don't give it the seriousness that it needs, then so many things can go wrong. One, you could be submitting data that's just not sufficient. And the only thing you're doing there is wasting time. The authority's going to come back and request the information. And while you're doing that, you're scrambling then. So for me, it's really about recognizing what can go wrong, recognizing the risks. And one of the risks, like we touched on, is massive delays that you can have from underestimating regulatory. So for me, it's about looking early, looking ahead and thinking, okay, what exactly do I need? How can I do this? And with my small team, how can we be efficient and engage the right help that we need to do things properly?
You started describing EU model with the authority there a little bit. At least that's what I gathered from it. As far as the markets that you work in, the models are totally different. So I led a working group, an internationally focused working group for 3 years, where we more or less scraped the bottom of the ocean and looked at all of the different countries that had combination product regulation.
Mm,
And we level set them against each other using a few topics. So things like clinical requirements, labeling requirements, whether or not they have a primary mode of action stipulation, whether or not they have a lead center, a secondary center that FDA has, etc. Now you live in Helsinki. The model you described was like the European model, but there are also emerging markets and differing markets where companies are more focused not only on the US,
mm,
Europe, but I think from my perception, China's really growing as a market. The Middle East is also growing as a market, and their regulators are following suit with prioritizing their participation in global bodies. So the Jordanian FDA, they submitted an application to join PICS back in 2021, and they were just granted it as the second Arab country. Jordan is a very small country,
mm.
right? I know my friend Munir, who's the podcast you've been on before, he's always involved in the Afro summits and stuff like that, where there's more focus in some of these countries that previously weren't looked at as major markets. What are you seeing as far as your regulatory practice? Are you guys planning for wider launch pad? Are you
Yeah,
working more on understanding those countries?
yeah, definitely. So you mentioned China there. I just like to mention there's a great newsletter, MedTech Chopsticks, by a friend of mine, Elaine Tan. And not to be dropping in a plug, but if somebody's really
I
interested
love
in
it.
Chinese regulatory, I would really suggest you check it out. On your question, yeah. So, like I said, I'm just back from Dubai, where I was at the International Food Safety Conference. And in the region, they're putting huge focus on and a topic that I'm very passionate about are regulatory sandboxes. So this is a really innovative thing that's happening also in some European countries and in the UK, but in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, they're really putting a lot of focus on it, and it's really great to see. So to answer your question, I would say UAE is really a region to keep our eyes on, especially with the reg lab that's coming out of Abu Dhabi. It's giving innovators this opportunity to like a sandbox where they can test out their innovations, iterate in real time and give data to the regulators and get immediate feedback. So I think the really great benefit is no longer do you have to submit everything at the beginning. You can submit your data incrementally and also get feedback. So yeah, certainly a market to keep our eye on when it comes to medtech innovation.
What you were describing sounds like a rolling submission.
Yeah, yeah. So do you mean
Isn't that
the
isn't that isn't that what you were saying about submitting data incrementally? Isn't that already an established practice?
it is already an established practice, but from experience, you don't usually get the feedback on the data that you're given incrementally. So, like, of course, that happens, but what?
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's from my experience what I've seen, and this is what they've
What's the point
noticed.
then?
Who knows? But that's what they notice over in those regions where, like, I mean, if I give you an example from the food tech where I also work, if you look at Singapore, they have a thing called the 30 by 30 initiative. And Singapore, by its
Mm.
very nature and geography, they need to become self sufficient. So they import an awful lot of their own food. So 30 by 30 is saying that they want to have 30% of their own food grown within the country by 2030. And one of the things they've done and recognized as a government, as a nation, is that they need to be open to the world in terms of attracting innovation that can also help innovators that are in the country. So by recognizing this national need, they've been able to be more innovative, they've been able to be pragmatic, and they've already approved some types of foods that are not approved anywhere else. And this is what we're seeing in the Middle East and the UAE as well now when we talk about this sandbox initiative. So it's countries recognizing that they need to move a bit faster. They need to do things differently and not be so bureaucratic. And of course, they want to help innovation, but the main reason, of course, is they also need the innovation. perhaps a bit quicker
Mm.
than Europe and the US did used to.
Um, Switching gears a little bit into UDI, which
Mm.
is why I reached out to you originally. UDI is a difficult topic to deal with. Serialization, aggregation with combination products, particularly for what would be in Europe called co-packs, or maybe they're borderline, where you're
Borderline.
buying and
Yeah.
importing, or you're cross-labeling, etc. Could you maybe for let's do a UDI 101, UDI and serialization 101. What is UDI and what is serialization? Maybe talk about if you could talk about the intent behind UDI first,
Mm.
and then we can talk about some of the details.
Yeah, so just to keep it very simple, so you have a medical device, and on that medical device, you have to have an identifier. So this is where we go with UDI, unique device identifier. And this allows you to trace. So one, you're labeling your device, but you're also allowing traceability. So if anything goes wrong, if something happens with that device while it's on the market or while it's being used in a healthcare setting, you're able to tell, okay, this device is unique and here's its actual identifier. So every device has one. And a lot of people who don't work in medtech, when they hear medical device, they just think of typical medical devices that look like a medical device. But there's so many
An
things like,
infusion pump.
yeah, everything. And if you'll see, to make it as lay as possible, if you see the barcode, usually a barcode, you'll see it on the device. So that's how you know. And then, of course, there will be the labeling where it's a class one, class two, and so on medical device. So yeah, so that's a UDI in simple terms. And like I mentioned, it's used for traceability. So if something goes wrong, you can tell exactly where it came from. So in Europe, not sure if I should mention it or not, but a lot of people are unhappy about it in the industry. It hasn't been implemented properly. So it's ticking an awful lot of professionals in the medtech industry here. But we UDIMED, so it's basically the database where all of the devices and their numbers have to be stored.
It's hard when you're introducing something like that. But as far as UDIMED and UDI, UDIMED is the repository for UDI in Europe, and GUDID is the one for the US, right?
Mm,
The reason that I even found out about you is because of a post that I saw that you put up on UDI.
mm,
And in the EU, where UDI was officially mandated for some of the more high risk classes, they decided to include even something as low risk as a class one device. Why did they do that? And some IVDs as well. Why did they do that? And how big is the impact of that kind of change?
yeah, so the reason they did it was because they noticed that even if a device was class one, it doesn't mean it's not without risks. So you still need to be able to track those devices when they're on the market. That's the basic need, or why you would have a UDI label, is to know where the device is, what the device does, and where it's come from. So that was the motivation. In terms of how it's been, yeah, how it's been going, a lot of startups were scrambling. So a lot of them would have been class one, and they wouldn't have had the UDI devices. But now suddenly with this change, they've had to kind of, get to grips with it and get their teams ready and start adding these labels to the devices. But as you know, it's not as simple as just taking a device and slapping a label on it. There's a whole lot of processes that have to be taken care of. So I would say startups were given enough time. Companies are given enough time to get to grips with it, I would say. But of course, in regulatory, there's always a thousand things going on at the same time. So, of course, there were a few hiccups along the way, but I think generally the companies have adapted well. So that post was like 6 months ago. Yeah, back in May. And I think I posted it 1 or 2 weeks before this new change came in. And my intention was just to inform, to let people know that, like, hey, heads up, deadline's approaching. You should get on top of this. But I was completely blown away by it. I think by this stage now, 6 months later, 115,000 impressions. It's been shared almost 1,000 times. I saw hundreds of comments. So, and it's shown me that when I looked at the analytics and the breakdown, like, it's not just regulatory people who are sharing and interacting and who find it interesting. It's people across all companies. So you have titles like operations manager, COO, and it's showing that the compliance and regulatory, and in this case, UDI compliance, it's not just a regulatory task, it's involving everyone. Supply chain, labeling, obviously, data management, marketing. Regulatory is not a department that's over in the corner by itself. It's everyone has a part to play. And I think something as simple as a UDI label change has shown that. And I think that's something that continues to fascinate me.
I found that the power of LinkedIn was just unbelievable for me. I started this podcast a few years ago with basically no following, and
Hmm.
it's just connections I've been able to make just because I'm able to say connect with a person whose article I read. Like I'll never forget there was a woman, Joanna
Hmm.
Gallant. I was working on a management we all go through phases, right? And there's Stephen Covey, if you've heard of him, like real famous author, Seven Habits. He talks about aha moments, paradigm shifts. Um, I was a young quality engineer and I was tasked with owning my site quality manual
Hmm.
for a big site. It was basically the biggest design center in North America for Pfizer, and I was tasked with leading the monthly and quarterly management reviews. So I was trying to get a grip on understanding management responsibility, understanding quality culture, understanding management review. This was a new quality system element that I was a product
Hmm.
guy. I wasn't used to all this stuff. So I read her article. It was called like Someone, Everyone, or No One Who Owns Quality. And she made the case where, yes, quality is everybody's job, and that's a good sentiment to have, but really management owns quality. Like they're the ones who are responsible. That's why it's called management responsibility. And that if everyone owns quality, that no one does. Long story short, I went about my days for months and years after that, after reading that article. And then I was able to connect with her on LinkedIn and just interview her.
Yeah, the power of LinkedIn.
And yeah, and it was for me one of the most impactful interviews that I've had just because I'm like, wow, this person really had an impact on me and they didn't even know it.
Yeah.
Last question I have for you, Stephen, is you ran for the European Parliament, which is not really understood, I think, in the US, like the European Commission versus the individual countries. Could you maybe talk about what you learned as far as how policy is made and if there's anything worth sharing that maybe explains the EC versus country thing because it's not particularly in the US. I would say I don't fully understand
Yeah,
it.
so basically, my motivation to run for the European Parliament was because for a very long time I was complaining on the sidelines and thinking, okay, why are they not doing this or doing that? But then last year, I decided, okay, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and I'm going to put my name forward and give it a go. And I gave it a good go with some friends of mine who were really supportive and helped with the campaign. There was a lot of people in the Dublin constituency in Ireland where I ran, over 20. But I have to say, coming to your question, I learned a lot about policy itself because you also learn about the system. And I think regulatory affairs, by its very nature, is very political. So for me, for my career, for Clarify, it was very good education, I would say, to see how things work in the system. And just for the listeners or watchers who probably wouldn't be so familiar with our politics in Europe, so we have 27 member states of the European Union. Ireland is one, Spain is another, for example. Each one has their own national parliament, and then we have one subnational European Parliament, and that's made up of all of the different MEPs who are elected by the constituent countries. And it's similar, I guess. I'm not sure. Would it be Congress or the in the US where you send congressmen and women to represent your state? So you could see it like that. Yeah. So overall, it was a good experience. Learned quite a lot about politics and how policies are implemented. And it's something I use now in Clarify. I do a lot of policy work. I help a lot of politicians come up with legislation drafts. So yeah, all in all, it was a very good experience.
And for clarity, the EC, the European Commission, is who decided on the implementation and adoption of EU MDR, any subsequent updates,
Yeah,
and
there's
stuff
a
like that, right?
nuance to that. So the way it works is the European Commission sits in one side and then they come up with the laws. They come up with the legislation. They write it. So they don't do this by themselves. Of course, they listen to industry. Industry lobbyists come to them and say, hey, look, how about this? We think this could be good for the industry. The European Commission and the commissioners, each country sends one commissioner. They would then write up the law, draft the law, and then this law is then sent to the European Parliament, where everyone, the MEPs, members of the European Parliament, can vote on it.
So the European Commission and the European Parliament are
Yeah,
two
yeah, they're
different
completely
things.
separate. So see them as executive and legislative.
Which one is
The
which?
commission is the executive and the parliament is legislative one. They're the ones who are voting on the draft laws that are coming from the European Commission and the commissioners. So when a law is passed, like MDR, that's been
Uh-huh.
passed from the commission written, passed to the European Parliament for voting, and then it's brought in. So with the laws in Europe, the way they work
Uh-huh.
are, to simplify it again, you would have a directive. So you'll be familiar with the MDD, Medical Device Directive. So that's how
MDD,
it
yeah, yeah.
was. But when it becomes a regulation, MDR, that means the member states, Ireland, Spain, and so on, they no longer have an option to utilize or follow this law or directive. When it becomes a regulation, then it's superimposed into their national law. So that's what we saw with MDD becoming MDR, and now it's enforced across the whole European Union.
Where can people find you, Stephen?
You can find me on LinkedIn. Yeah, I really like connecting with people, so feel free to connect. And also, you can go if you want to read about the type of projects I'm involved in across, yeah, all different types of areas like MedTech, food tech, fintech as well. You can go to clarify.fi. So CLARIFI.fi. That's Finland. Yeah, look forward to hearing from anyone who'd like to continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on,
Yeah,
Stephen. This
thanks
was
a lot,
great.
Subhi.